Most people think they know how the Byzantine Empire began. They picture a single clean moment, the year 330, when the Roman Emperor Constantine dedicated a glittering new capital on the shores of the Bosphorus and called it Constantinople. Or maybe they picture 476, when the last emperor in Rome was quietly deposed and the west went dark, leaving the east to carry the torch of Rome alone. It's a tidy story with a clear starting point and a clear inheritance. Rome fell in the west, and something new and magnificent rose in the east to take its place. Here's the problem. That story is not just simplified. It's fundamentally wrong. There was no birth certificate for the Byzantine Empire. There was no morning when the citizens of Constantinople woke up and were told they now lived in a new civilization. In fact, the word Byzantine wasn't even used by the people who supposedly built that empire. Not once, not ever, in over 1,000 years of its existence. The term was invented by a German historian named Hieronymus Wolff in 1557, more than a century after the empire had already fallen to the Ottomans. The people who lived through what we now call the Byzantine Empire called themselves something else entirely. They called themselves Romans, Rhomaioi. To them, there was no fall of Rome in 476. There was no new empire rising from the ashes of the old one. As far as they were concerned, Rome never fell at all. It simply kept going, under different emperors, in a different capital, for another 1,000 years. So if there was no founding moment, if the people themselves didn't believe they were building something new, then where did this civilization we call Byzantine actually come from? The real answer is far stranger and far more violent than the story you were taught. It wasn't founded. It was forged through more than 3 centuries of catastrophe, plague, religious warfare, and near-total collapse, until the empire that emerged on the other side was so transformed that later historians felt compelled to give it a brand new name, even though the people living through it never asked for one. To understand where this civilization truly came from, we have to go back long before Constantine, long before Constantinople even existed as an idea. We have to go back to a moment when the Roman Empire came closer to complete annihilation than at almost any other point in its 1,000-year history, and it happened 2 full centuries before the West would even fall. That moment is known today as the crisis of the Third Century, and if you've never heard of it, you're far from alone. It rarely makes it into the popular telling of Rome's story, and yet without it, nothing that came later makes any sense at all. Between the years 235 and 284, the Roman Empire nearly tore itself apart. In less than 50 years, the empire went through more than 20 emperors, most of whom were murdered, overthrown, or killed in battle within months of taking power. Roman legions on the frontiers began proclaiming their own generals as emperor, marching them toward Rome, and toppling whoever currently held the throne, only to be toppled themselves a season later. At one point, the empire fractured into 3 competing states simultaneously: a breakaway empire in Gaul in the west, a breakaway kingdom in Palmyra in the east, and whatever remained of the central Roman state in between. Barbarian tribes crossed the Rhine and the Danube nearly at will. The Sassanid Persian Empire, a newly aggressive power that had just overthrown the older Parthian dynasty, captured an actual Roman emperor, Valerian, in battle in the year 260, and by most ancient accounts, kept him as a living trophy until his death. The Roman currency was debased so severely that the silver content of its coinage collapsed to a small fraction of what it had been, triggering runaway inflation across the entire Mediterranean economy. Trade networks that had bound the empire together for centuries broke down. Cities that had stood unwalled for generations, confident in Roman peace, began hastily throwing up defensive walls for the first time in living memory. It's worth sitting with just how close this 50-year window came to ending the Roman story altogether, because it rarely gets the attention it deserves in the popular imagination. Historians of this period sometimes describe it as the moment the empire genuinely could have simply dissolved into a patchwork of successor kingdoms, centuries before that actually happened in the West. There was no guarantee of recovery. Plague swept through the population during this same window as well, a lesser-known outbreak known to modern scholars as the Plague of Cyprian, further hollowing out the manpower the empire needed to defend itself. Provincial governors increasingly stopped waiting for instructions from a distant, unstable capital and began governing, taxing, and defending their territories as though Rome itself might not be coming back. In many real, practical ways, the unified Roman world very nearly ended in the 3rd century, 200 years before the conventional story says it did in the West, and more than 300 years before the transformation that actually produced what we call Byzantium. This is the part that most popular retellings of Roman history skip entirely, and it's the single most important thing to understand about where Byzantium actually comes from. The Roman Empire that emerged from this 50-year near-death experience was not the same empire that had entered it. And crucially, the parts of the empire that suffered the least and recovered the fastest were overwhelmingly in the east. The eastern provinces, Greece, Anatolia, Syria, Egypt were richer, more urbanized, more densely populated, and generally further from the worst of the barbarian invasions along the Rhine. While the western provinces struggled to recover, the eastern half of the empire was quietly becoming the center of gravity for the entire Roman world, decades before anyone had ever heard the name Constantine. The emperor who finally dragged Rome back from the brink was a hardened soldier named Diocletian, who took power in 284. And Diocletian understood something that no emperor before him had fully grasped. A single ruler, based in a single city, simply could not respond fast enough to threats erupting simultaneously across a Mediterranean empire that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia. His solution was radical. He split the imperial administration into 4 regions, a system historians call the Tetrarchy, with 2 senior emperors and 2 junior ones, each responsible for defending and governing a quarter of the Roman world. For the first time in Roman history, there was an explicit, formal acknowledgement that one man in one capital could not hold the whole thing together anymore. This decision, made purely as a practical response to a military and administrative emergency, planted the seed of everything that followed. It did not create an Eastern Empire and a Western Empire in any final sense. Diocletian himself insisted the empire remained one unified state under a shared system of law and shared coinage. But it established a precedent, a working assumption, that the Roman world could be governed as separate administrative halves without ceasing to be Rome. That assumption would prove impossible to fully undo. Diocletian went further than simply dividing command. He fundamentally re-engineered how the Roman state extracted resources from its own population, replacing an older, inconsistent tax system with a rigorous empire-wide census and a standardized system of taxation in kind, demanding fixed quantities of grain, livestock, and goods rather than relying purely on currency that had been catastrophically debased during the recent crisis. He also dramatically expanded the size of the army and the imperial bureaucracy needed to administer it all, which meant the state now needed more revenue than ever, extracted more efficiently than ever, just to keep functioning. It was, in effect, a wartime economy made permanent, and it reshaped daily life for ordinary provincials for generations. None of this was designed with any Eastern civilization in mind. It was designed purely to keep the existing Roman state from collapsing again the way it nearly had. But every one of these reforms, the administrative split, the militarized economy, the empire-wide bureaucratic machinery, would become foundational scaffolding for the state that eventually emerged in the East, centuries after Diocletian himself was gone. A few decades later, a general named Constantine fought his way to sole power over the entire Roman world, and it's here that the popular story usually begins, with the founding of Constantinople in 330. But look closely at what Constantine was actually doing, and it becomes clear that even he wasn't founding something new. He was making a calculated bet on where the empire's future already lay. The site he chose, the ancient Greek city of Byzantium on the Bosphorus Strait, sat at one of the most defensible and commercially valuable crossroads on Earth, controlling the passage between Europe and Asia, between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. Constantine wasn't turning his back on Rome. He was moving the empire's center of gravity to where the wealth, the population, and the strategic advantage already were. For decades afterward, Constantinople was simply referred to by contemporaries as New Rome. Not a replacement, not a rival, an extension. Now here's where the story most people are told starts to skip ahead far too quickly, because for the next century and a half after Constantine, there was still, in the minds of nearly everyone living through it, only one Roman Empire, temporarily administered by multiple emperors for practical reasons. That illusion of permanent unity finally broke in the year 395, when the Emperor Theodosius I died and, following increasingly common practice, divided imperial authority between his 2 sons, Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west. What made this division different from every prior split was almost accidental. Nobody expected it to become permanent. And yet, no emperor would ever again rule both halves of the Roman world together. Historians have argued for generations over whether a more capable ruler could have reunified the 2 halves in the following decades, and it's a genuinely open question, because what happened next was not a story of 2 equal partners drifting apart. It was a story of one half slowly bleeding out while the other, protected by the same fortifications, wealth, and administrative depth built up since the crisis of the 3rd century, endured. Waves of Gothic, Vandal, and Hunnic incursions tore through the western provinces across the 5th century, while Constantinople, behind walls so formidable they would not be breached by force for nearly 1,000 years, largely weathered the same storms. When the Germanic general Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor, a teenager named Romulus Augustulus, in 476, the reaction from Constantinople was not panic or grief. It was, if anything, bureaucratic. The Eastern emperor simply continued regarding himself as the sole legitimate Roman emperor. The western half now an unfortunate but temporary loss he fully expected, in principle, to eventually reclaim. It's worth pausing on just how differently 476 actually registered in the East compared to how later historians would come to treat it. There was no dramatic announcement that an empire had fallen. Odoacer, the barbarian general who deposed the last Western boy emperor, didn't even claim the imperial title for himself. Instead, he sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople as a gesture of formal submission, acknowledging that there was now, once again, only one legitimate Roman emperor, and that emperor sat in the East. To contemporaries living through it, this looked less like the end of Rome and more like an administrative consolidation, an unfortunate but almost bureaucratic tidying up of a western half that had been effectively unable to govern or defend itself for decades already. It would take modern historians, writing centuries later with the benefit of hindsight, to retroactively declare 476 the year Rome fell. Nobody actually alive in Constantinople that year treated it that way at all. And that expectation very nearly came true, under the reign of an emperor who represents, in many ways, the glittering high watermark of everything the surviving Roman state still believed itself capable of. His name was Justinian, and he took the throne in 527. Justinian's reign is, on its surface, the closest thing to a golden age this civilization ever produced. He commissioned the rebuilding of the Hagia Sophia, a cathedral so vast and so architecturally daring that contemporaries described entering it as feeling as though the dome itself was suspended from heaven by a golden chain. He ordered the complete codification of Roman law into a single systematic body of legal text, the Corpus Juris Civilis, a document so influential that its principles still echo through legal systems across the modern world. And most ambitiously of all, he launched an extraordinary military campaign to reconquer the lost western provinces, sending his brilliant general Belisarius first to shatter the Vandal kingdom in North Africa, then to seize Rome itself back from the Ostrogoths. For a moment, it looked as though the fracture of 395 might actually be undone. Roman armies once again controlled Italy, North Africa, and parts of Spain. The dream of a fully reunified Mediterranean empire, ruled once more from a single throne, seemed within reach. But look, beneath the marble and the mosaics, and the reconquest was already quietly bankrupting the state that had achieved it. Decades of continuous warfare in Italy devastated the very provinces Justinian was trying to reclaim, leaving them poorer and more depopulated than when the Ostrogoths had ruled them. The military campaigns drained the imperial treasury at a pace tax revenue could not sustain. And then, in the year 541, a catastrophe struck that dwarfed every battlefield loss combined. Modern genetic analysis of ancient skeletal remains has confirmed what chroniclers of the time described in horrified detail. Bubonic plague, arriving through trade routes from Central Asia or East Africa, swept into Constantinople and then across the entire Mediterranean world. Contemporary accounts describe bodies piling up faster than they could be buried, entire households wiped out overnight, and the emperor himself reportedly falling ill with the disease before narrowly recovering. Modern estimates of the mortality vary widely, but the most careful demographic reconstructions suggest the eastern Mediterranean may have lost somewhere between a fifth and a third of its entire population within a few catastrophic years. This event, now known to historians as the Plague of Justinian, did something no barbarian army had managed to do. It permanently crippled the tax base, the military manpower, and the agricultural workforce that the entire reconquest depended on. Consider what a population collapse on that scale actually meant in practical terms for a state that ran on taxation and manpower. Entire villages across Anatolia, Greece, and Syria simply ceased to exist within a single generation, their fields left fallow because there was no one left to work them. Skilled tradesmen, scribes, and administrators, the very people who kept the machinery of imperial bureaucracy running, died in numbers historians still struggle to fully quantify. Military recruitment, already strained by the ongoing wars in Italy and North Africa, became a genuine crisis, since there were simply fewer able-bodied men left in the provinces to conscript. And unlike a military defeat, which might be reversed by the next generation soldiers, a demographic collapse of this magnitude took decades, in some regions closer to a century, to even partially recover from. The empire Justinian left behind wasn't just financially exhausted, it was biologically hollowed out, and that hollowing would still be felt when the far greater crisis of the following century arrived. So the empire that Justinian left behind when he died in 565 was, in reality, a paradox. Magnificent on the surface, its treasury exhausted, its population devastated by plague, and its newly reconquered territories in Italy and Spain far too thinly defended to hold for long. Within just 3 years of Justinian's death, a new Germanic people, the Lombards, poured into Italy and seized most of what Belisarius had spent a fortune in blood and gold reclaiming. The The dream of reunification, it turned out, had been a beautiful and unsustainable illusion, built on a foundation that was already cracking underneath it, even at the height of its glory. And if the plague and the collapse in Italy were the match, what came next was the fire that would finally, truly transform this state into something categorically new. In the early 7th century, the empire found itself locked in a catastrophic war with its oldest rival, the Sassanid Persian Empire. By the 610s, Persian armies had done something no enemy of Rome had achieved in over 1,000 years. They captured Antioch. They captured Jerusalem, carrying off what Christians believed to be the true cross itself as a war trophy. They captured Alexandria, seizing Egypt, the empire's most important source of grain. Persian forces advanced all the way to the shores of the Bosphorus, camping within sight of the walls of Constantinople itself. For a genuine, terrifying moment, it looked as though the Eastern Roman state, the one half of the empire that had survived every previous catastrophe, was about to be extinguished entirely. The emperor who saved it, Heraclius, pulled off one of the most remarkable military reversals in ancient history, stripping the imperial treasury bare, even melting down church silver to fund his campaigns, and leading a series of daring counteroffensives deep into Persian territory that ultimately forced a complete Persian surrender by 628. On paper, it was a total victory. The lost provinces were returned. The true cross was recovered and ceremonially restored to Jerusalem. Heraclius should have gone down in history as the man who saved Rome for the second time. It's genuinely difficult to overstate how close the empire came to simply ending during those desperate years. At the campaign's lowest point, Persian and Avar forces coordinated a joint siege of Constantinople itself in 626, attacking the city's land walls and its harbor simultaneously, while Heraclius and the bulk of the army were far away campaigning deep in Persian territory, a gamble that could easily have cost him the capital entirely while he was busy trying to win the war elsewhere. The city held, largely thanks to those same massive fortifications built centuries earlier, and thanks to a fleet that decisively defeated the Avar naval assault in the Golden Horn. Had Constantinople fallen in 626, there would very likely be no story of a Byzantine Empire to tell at all. The entire subsequent history of the state hinged on walls built generations before Heraclius was even born. Instead, both empires, Roman and Persian alike, had fought each other to complete exhaustion at almost exactly the moment a new and entirely unexpected power was uniting for the first time in the Arabian Peninsula. Within just 6 years of Heraclius's triumphant peace with Persia, Arab armies, unified under the banner of a new faith, erupted out of Arabia and struck both exhausted empires simultaneously. The Sassanid Persian Empire, with no reserves left to call upon, was completely and permanently destroyed within a single generation, wiped off the map entirely. The Roman state, though it survived, lost an almost unimaginable share of everything it had just spent a generation and its entire treasury reclaiming. Syria fell. Palestine fell. And by 642, Egypt, the province that had fed Constantinople with subsidized grain for 300 years, fell as well. Within less than a decade, the empire that Heraclius had just saved from Persian conquest lost roughly 2/3 of its territory and, by most modern estimates, well over half of its remaining tax revenue, to an entirely different enemy that barely existed as a unified power just 10 years earlier. This is the true rupture, not 330, not 476. This is the moment historians who specialize in this period point to as the actual birth of what we now call the Byzantine Empire, because the state that stumbled out of the 7th century was almost unrecognizable compared to the one that had entered it. Consider what had to change simply to survive. Latin, the language of Roman law and administration for over 6 centuries, was formally replaced by Greek as the official language of government under Heraclius, a symbolic and practical acknowledgement that this was now, in every functional sense, a Greek-speaking state, whatever its citizens still called themselves. The old provincial system, designed for a wealthy, secure, deeply urbanized empire, was scrapped entirely and replaced with something historians call the theme system, dividing the drastically shrunken remaining territory into military districts where soldiers were settled on land grants in exchange for hereditary military service because there was no longer enough tax revenue left to pay a traditional, professional army. Constantinople itself, once a city of perhaps 500,000 people at its height, shrank dramatically as trade routes collapsed and the grain subsidies from Egypt vanished forever. And it wasn't only the borders and the bureaucracy that transformed. It was the entire character of the state's identity. Bring together everything that had happened by this point. The geographic pivot toward the wealthier East that began during the crisis of the 3rd century. The administrative habit of division that began under Diocletian. The permanent political split of 395. The exhausting and ultimately unsustainable dream of reconquest under Justinian. The demographic devastation of the plague. and finally the catastrophic territorial collapse of the 7th century. And you get something that looks nothing like the sprawling, multi-ethnic, Latin-speaking, religiously pluralistic empire that Augustus had ruled 6 centuries earlier. What remained was smaller, poorer, almost entirely Greek-speaking, militarized down to its administrative core, and fused with an intensity of Orthodox Christian identity that would define it for the rest of its existence. None of this happened to statistics on a page. It happened to real people, in real cities, over multiple generations of accumulated trauma. Refugees from the Persian and Arab conquests streamed into Anatolia and Constantinople by the tens of thousands, uprooted from ancestral homes in Syria, Palestine, and Egypt that their families had occupied for centuries. Cities across Anatolia that had once been open, prosperous urban centers hastily walled themselves in, shrinking to defensible fortress towns as the open countryside became a war zone raided almost annually by Arab forces. The plague, meanwhile, did not strike once and disappear. Waves of the same pandemic recurred roughly every decade or so for the next 2 centuries, meaning entire generations grew up never knowing a world without recurring, unpredictable mass death sweeping through their communities. Grain that had once flowed freely from Egypt at subsidized prices was gone forever, and cities that had never had to think seriously about famine now had to. Religious controversy compounded the crisis rather than easing it, as the empire's remaining population argued bitterly over questions of doctrine and, within another century, tore itself apart internally over the iconoclasm controversy, a struggle over whether religious images were sacred devotion or forbidden idolatry that split the court, the church, and the population for the better part of 100 years. This is not the story of a magnificent new civilization being founded in triumph. It's the story of an old civilization stripped down to its bones by war, plague, and territorial collapse, and forced to rebuild itself into something leaner, harder, and more singular in identity, simply in order to survive at all. The people living through it never once believed they were founding something. They believed, with total sincerity, that they were the last Romans standing, holding the line against a world that had turned catastrophically against them. It would take a German scholar working nearly a century after the whole state had finally fallen to the Ottoman Turks in 1453 to look back at this transformed, embattled, Greek-speaking medieval state and decide it deserved an entirely separate name from the empire of Augustus and Trajan, as though 13 centuries of continuous institutional survival could be neatly filed away as something other than Rome. And this is where the deeper lesson sits, because it isn't really a lesson about the 7th century at all. It's a lesson about how we tell the story of any institution, any civilization, any identity that manages to survive catastrophe. We are drawn, almost instinctively, to clean origin stories. A single founding date, a single founding document, a single heroic figure cutting a ribbon at the birth of something new. It's a satisfying shape for a story, and it's very often simply not how things actually happen. The truth, far more often, is that institutions are not founded so much as they are forged, reshaped again and again under pressures nobody chose and nobody could fully control, until the thing that survives bears only a partial resemblance to the thing that began. Nations rewrite their own founding myths for the same reason. Companies invent tidy garage startup origin stories that erase the decades of prior groundwork that actually made the breakthrough possible. We are, as a species, uncomfortable with the idea that the things we consider fixed and singular were actually built by accident, through crisis, by people who had no idea they were laying the foundation for something that would outlast them by 1,000 years. The deeper you sit with the real story of Byzantium's origin, the harder it becomes to draw a clean line anywhere at all. Was it born when Diocletian split the administration for purely practical reasons in 284? When Constantine moved the capital east in 330? When Theodosius divided the throne between his sons in 395? When Rome fell in the west in 476 and nobody in the east even blinked? When Justinian's dream of reunification collapsed under the weight of plague and bankruptcy? Or only in the desperate, transformed state that clawed its way out of the Persian and Arab wars of the 7th century, Greek-speaking, militarized, and orthodox to its core? Historians still argue fiercely over which of these moments deserves to be called the true beginning, and the honest answer is that the argument itself is the point. There was no single beginning. There was only an old empire, under relentless pressure across 4 centuries, refusing, again and again, to die. This same pattern shows up far beyond the ancient Mediterranean, if you know where to look for it. Modern nations love to point to a single revolution, a single declaration, a single founding document, as the moment they came into being, when the reality underneath is almost always a far messier accumulation of compromises, crises, and quiet transformations stretching back generations before that famous date and continuing long after it. Institutions we treat today as timeless and singular, a currency, a legal system, a national identity, are, more often than historians like to admit in the tidy version of the story, the surviving residue of repeated near collapse, reshaped by people who were simply trying to make it through the next crisis, not consciously laying a cornerstone for posterity. Byzantium is simply one of the clearest, longest-running examples in recorded history of exactly how that process actually works, because it happened in the open, across documented centuries, to a civilization that never stopped insisting, the entire time, that it hadn't changed at all. And maybe that's the most important thing this story actually teaches us. The empire we call Byzantine never saw itself as something new because, in the truest sense, it wasn't. It was Rome, still standing, having survived plague, civil war, invasion, and catastrophic territorial loss by becoming almost unrecognizable to itself in the process. Survival, it turns out, was never about staying the same. It was about how much an institution could be forced to change while its people still refused to admit they had become something else. And whether we're talking about an ancient empire or the institutions and identities we build today, that same uncomfortable truth still holds. What survives is rarely what was founded. It's what proved willing, generation after generation, to be remade. If this changed the way you think about where civilizations actually come from, hit that subscribe button. We go deep on the true, often buried origins of the empires, institutions, and turning points that shaped the world you live in, the kind of history that never quite makes it into the textbook version of events. Drop a comment below and tell me which moment you think deserves to be called the true birth of Byzantium, Diocletian's reforms, Constantine's new capital, or the crisis of the 7th century. I'd genuinely like to hear your case. And if you found this valuable, make sure to like. The video, it genuinely helps this channel reach more people who care about the real story behind the history they thought they already knew. I'll see you in the next one.